Snow lay 3 yards deep on the Pyrenees in the bitter winter of 1942, and a woman was dragging herself up through it towards Spain. On one side of the narrow track, the mountain fell away into a void several hundred feet down. She had no cane, no snowshoes, and only one leg of her own. The other was an 8-pound contraption of hollow wood and aluminium, lashed to her waist with leather and corsetry, and every sideways step jarred the hip above it until the raw place where her left leg ended had worn open once more. She was 36 years old, half-starved, and climbing the cruelest stretch of the range by a route that had broken younger, stronger, whole-bodied men. She was also, at that precise moment, the most hunted Allied agent in occupied France. The German secret police knew her wireless, her circuits, the safe houses she had raised from nothing. What they did not know was her face, her true name, or that she was an American, a Baltimore banker's daughter, once groomed for an advantageous marriage, who had spent the years since being told, again and again, that there was nothing useful a one-legged woman could do. Her own country had filed her away as a person of no importance. The men hunting her through the snow knew better. And the road that delivered her onto this mountain had begun, improbably, on a veranda in Maryland and a sunlit marsh in Turkey. Barbara Hall had her only daughter's future arranged long before the girl was old enough to refuse it. Born in Baltimore in the spring of 1906, Virginia was the youngest child of a banking family, whose fortune had already begun its quiet retreat. The country house at Boxhorn Farm pumped its water in from a stream and went without central heating. The elegant apartment in town was only rented. For a family sliding gently down from its former height, a daughter, married into money, was the way back up. And Virginia, tall, rangy, with sparkling nut-brown eyes and a smile she rationed carefully, was expected to be the one who made that climb. She had other plans from the very beginning. At her private school, she rode bareback, skinned rabbits, shot with a rifle her doting father had given her, and once turned up to lessons wearing a bracelet of live snakes. Her classmates voted her class president, editor-in-chief, and with some prescience, class prophet. They thought her the most original girl among them, and she admitted that she worked to live up to the reputation. In her school yearbook of 1924, she set down a line that would read, years later, like a creed written in advance of the life that earned it. She must have liberty, with as large a charter as she pleased. At 19, she dutifully became engaged to an eligible young man, looked hard at the narrow domestic existence waiting on the far side of the wedding, and called it off. What she wanted was the wider world, and she crossed an ocean to find it. The Paris of the 1920s took her in completely. Enrolled at a school of political science on the left bank, she spent more hours learning from actresses and racing drivers and budding politicians in the cafes of Saint-Germain than from any of her tutors. She acquired 5 languages, a lasting reverence for France as a kind of second country, and a settled conviction that a woman might work and travel and decide for herself. She came home, meaning to become a diplomat, a profession that had, until then, almost entirely reserved itself for men. The doors closed one after another. She sat the Foreign Service examination and was turned away. Her father, the one person who had always indulged her, collapsed on a Baltimore pavement in January of 1931 and was gone within hours. He was 59, and much of the family money went with him. She took the only post the State Department would give a woman of her ambitions, a clerk's desk, coding telegrams in the American Embassy in Warsaw, $2,000 a year. The same secretarial rung her mother had climbed a generation before. From Warsaw, she transferred to a consulate at Smyrna on the Turkish coast, drawn by the marshes and lagoons where she could shoot. It was there, on the 8th of December, in 1933, that the life she had been building came apart in an instant. Climbing a wire fence through the tall reeds with her father's 12-gauge gun on her shoulder, she slipped. The gun caught in her long coat as she fell. She reached to grab it, and it fired at point-blank range into her left foot. The wound itself she might have survived intact. The infection that crept into it over the following weeks she very nearly did not. By Christmas, the foot had turned black, and the poison was climbing her leg. In an era before antibiotics, there was nothing to be done but cut. On Christmas Day of 1933, surgeons took her left leg off below the knee. She was 27. What followed was not recovery so much as a second siege. A fresh poisoning of the blood set in. Her heart raced, and her organs faltered, and for a stretch of those weeks, she was closer to dying than to living. It was in that delirium that she experienced what she would describe, ever after, as a visitation. Her father, thousands of miles away, seemed to stand at her bedside and tell her that it was her duty to survive, and that if she truly could not bear the pain, he would come back for her. She was not a religious woman in any formal sense, but she believed to the end of her days that Ned had spoken to her, and she fought her way back to life with a ghost for company. Whether the figure was real or conjured by a fevered mind matters less than what she took from it. She came out of that room convinced that having endured the worst thing she could imagine, she could endure anything. Her own country was not yet persuaded. She taught herself to walk again on a clunky 8-pound leg of painted wood and aluminium, strapped on with leather and corsetry that chafed her skin raw in the heat, and she went back to work. But when she pressed once more to enter the diplomatic corps she had dreamed of since girlhood, she was informed that the regulations would not have her. The department did not, in those years, admit those who had lost a limb, and in practice it had little appetite for women either. Only a handful of the 1,500 serving Foreign Service officers were female. She had been refused first for her sex, and now for her body, and she absorbed both refusals the way she absorbed most things, quietly, stubbornly, and with a private resolve to enter, as she put it to a friend, by the back door. Here is the cruelty and the making of her in a single stroke. The accident that her own government treated as the end of her usefulness handed her the two things the coming war would need most: a constitution that had already looked death down and refused it, and a hunger to prove herself that no comfortable life would ever have sharpened to such an edge. A nation told her she was a woman of no importance. It would take a continent on fire and an enemy willing to give her the recognition her homeland withheld before anyone discovered how wrong that was. When the war came, it found her already in France, and it found her useful at last. By the spring of 1940, she was driving an ambulance for the French army, threading a single moving vehicle through a tide of 10 million refugees streaming south away from the advancing German columns. She drove toward the fighting when everyone else drove away from it, low on fuel and medicine, pressing the clutch with a prosthetic foot until her hip screamed, picking up the wounded under the screaming dive of Stuka bombers and the strafing of fighter planes skimming the treetops. She had spent years being told there was nothing a one-legged woman could do. On those roads, she discovered that she had not felt so thrillingly alive in a very long while. Then France fell, and the ambulances stopped, and she made her way out across the Pyrenees the easy way for now, by train through Spain and on to London. The city she reached in the winter of 1940 was the last unconquered capital of Western Europe, improvising in the dark a kind of warfare it had never fought before. A new and secret organization had just been stood up on Winston Churchill's instruction, charged with setting the occupied continent ablaze. The Special Operations Executive, run out of a requisitioned building on Baker Street, in the business of dropping trained agents behind enemy lines to organize, sabotage, and arm a resistance that barely yet existed. They were desperate for people who could pass as French. And Virginia could pass as French better than almost anyone they had. She spoke the language, she knew the country intimately, and she carried a quality the recruiters prized above marksmanship. She did not look like anyone's idea of a spy. The Second World War's combatants, on every side, had been raised to believe that a woman's place ran no further than children, church, and kitchen, and that conviction was a door Virginia could walk straight through. The man who took the gamble on her overrode the obvious objection, the leg, the 8 pounds of wood that could not run and could barely climb, and signed her on. She became the first woman the organization's French section ever sent into the field. Her cover was elegant in its simplicity. The United States was not yet at war, which made an American passport one of the most valuable documents in Europe, and she carried one. She would enter unoccupied France openly, as an accredited correspondent for an American newspaper, filing dispatches on daily life under the new order, a job that not only explained her presence, but let her ask questions, travel, and meet people without arousing suspicion. In August of 1941, she settled in Lyon, the grimy industrial city on the confluence of two rivers that was becoming the unofficial capital of the French resistance, and she set to work. She began with almost nothing and built from the ground up. Operating under the name Marie, she turned a journalist's address book into something far more dangerous, a web of doctors, brothel keepers, factory owners, policemen, and farmers' wives, each useful in a different way, each a thread she alone held. A gynecologist's clinic became a message drop. A brothel's bank account became a channel for laundering London's money. She found safe houses, vetted couriers, arranged the reception of agents parachuted in by night, and made herself, within months, the indispensable fixed point around which the others turned. London had sent her in as one operative among several. She was rapidly becoming the one who held the rest together, the person the desperate came to when every other plan had failed. The test of what she had built came in the form of 12 men rotting in a prison in the southwest. They were agents of the same secret service she worked for, half British, half French, rounded up months earlier when a single arrest unraveled an entire reception party and left to languish in the fortress at Périgueux. Known among themselves as Clan Cameron, they had endured a winter without heating, 10 minutes a day in a yard whose only tap had frozen solid, a daily ration of 1 bowl of greasy liquid and a measured scrap of bread, and the slow erosion of men who do not know whether they will be tried, deported, or stood against a wall. London wanted them back. They were trained wireless operators and saboteurs, precisely the experts. The coming campaign could not spare, and London had no idea how to get them. Virginia had been sending in food parcels for months and chafing at her lack of authority to do more. The push came from outside the service. Gaby Bloch, the wife of one of the imprisoned Frenchmen, had been arrested with the group and then released, and she had spent the month since lobbying ministers to no effect and watching her options run out. She made her way to Lyon, to the hotel bar where Marie could be found, and laid the reality of the prison on the table. The beatings, the disease, the lice, the men's strength and spirits draining away by the week. She insisted that Virginia was their last hope. One of the prisoners, a resourceful former car salesman named Georges, had also smuggled out a letter, carefully worded to say the opposite of what it meant, trusting her to read between the lines. Virginia read them perfectly. She drew up a plan, promised Baker Street that if the men could not come out officially, they would come out unofficially, and extracted a grudging authorization from a London that plainly did not expect her to manage it. She started by getting them moved, through the American ambassador at Vichy, whom she persuaded on grounds of pure humanity, without ever revealing that the prisoners were secret agents. She engineered their transfer to an internment camp at Mauzac in the Dordogne. The new camp was no softer in its purpose, but it was open air. The men were housed together in a single hut. They could cook food brought in from outside, and they could see through the wire to the world beyond it. That sightline was everything. A fortress is escaped from by tunneling under hope itself. An open camp can be studied, timed, and beaten. The men began, from the inside, to prepare. What they needed was tools, and the genius of the operation was in how the tools arrived. Virginia was far too well known to go near the camp herself, so she trained Gaby into a courier and ran the whole supply chain through a woman, making the 70-mile round trip 3 times a week with parcels for her husband. The guards searched her. They found a devoted wife bringing food and clean laundry to a prisoner, exactly as the parcels appeared to be and exactly as they were designed to appear. Inside a jar of jam lay a file. Folded into the fresh laundry was a pair of wire cutters. A hollowed-out book carried a small screwdriver and a hammer. Tins of good sardines had been chosen as much for the quality of their reusable metal as for the fish. George, a skilled hand in civilian life, took an impression of the barracks lock in bread from the canteen and filed himself a key. Every evening the men's choir bellowed out the most obscene songs in their repertoire, and under the cover of that noise the filing and the hammering went on. Even getting word in and out was solved with a flourish that bordered on theater. A genial elderly priest, a veteran who had lost both legs in the previous war, began paying pastoral visits to the prisoners, lifting their morale and arranging small comforts. One day, having had himself carried up the steps into their hut in his wheelchair, he beckoned the men close, posted a lookout, and told one of them to reach in under his cassock where his legs should have been. What the man found there was a wireless transmitter, smuggled in beneath the robes of a legless priest, tuned and ready. They were to hide it, the priest said, and forget entirely how it had come to them. No one in the hut needed to ask who had arranged a thing so audacious. Outside the wire, Virginia assembled the second half of the plan, the part that mattered most, because a breakout that ends in recapture is merely a delayed execution. She recruited a guard, a man named Sevilla, who asked for no payment beyond eventual passage to England to join the Free French. His first contribution was to convince the camp commandant that the watchtower nearest the prisoner's hut swayed dangerously in the wind and ought to go unmanned at night. She enlisted the chief of an escape line to arrange safe houses, a getaway driver, forged papers, ration cards, and the long onward passage over the mountains to Spain. Most carefully of all, she found a hideaway close enough to the camp to receive the men in those first nail-biting hours when the danger of recapture runs highest. There were 100 such details, and she held every one of them in her head. On the chosen night, with the tower dark and the key cut and the wire ready to be parted, the 12 men of Clan Cameron went out through the fence and vanished into the arrangements, waiting for them. They were driven to the hideaway, moved on through the safe houses, and passed eventually over the Pyrenees into Spain. Every one of them got away. It was the Secret Service's first successful mass escape of the war, and it had been conceived and run by the one-legged American clerk her own State Department had filed under women of no importance. What that escape demonstrated was something the men with guns and parachutes had been slower to grasp. The decisive weapon in this new kind of war was not firepower. It was patience, attention to the texture of ordinary life, and an almost unbearable tolerance for risk distributed across a chain of unremarkable people. A wife with a jar of jam, a guard who wanted only to fight for his country, a legless priest with a radio where his legs had been. Virginia's particular gift was that she could see the whole machine at once and trust each part to hold. 12 men walked out of a guarded camp because a woman in Lyon understood, better than almost anyone then fighting, that the quietest move is often the one that wins. Success made her visible, and visibility, in her line of work, was the beginning of the end. The Mausac breakout was exactly the kind of triumph that could not stay quiet for long, and across Lyon, the German secret police had begun to assemble the silhouette of the agent they could not name. They did not have her face or her nationality. What they had was a manner of walking the rolling, slightly dragging gait she could never fully disguise when she was tired, and from it they built a legend and a quarry. The wireless intercepts told them a circuit was being run by someone called Marie. The street informers told them about a tall foreign woman who limped. The two descriptions converged, and the hunt for the limping lady of Lyon became, for a certain kind of officer, a personal obsession. Foremost among them was the head of the local Gestapo, a young man whose appetite for the work would later earn him a place among the most notorious figures of the occupation. He understood that the Secret Service was the spine of the whole underground threat, and that breaking it meant breaking the people who ran it. The methods his organization used on those it captured were among the darkest. The war produced designed not merely to extract names, but to annihilate the will to withhold them, and the prospect of what awaited her if she were. Ever-taken hung over Virginia constantly. She knew that anyone caught in her orbit faced the same. The pressure of that knowledge, sustained day after day with no relief, was a weight few could have carried. She carried it for the better part of a year, and went on recruiting, arming, and rescuing as though she did not feel it. Her undoing, when it came, did not come from the men hunting her in the open. It came wearing a clerical collar. An agent of German military intelligence had built himself a near-perfect disguise, a priest, plausible and devout, who attached himself to the edges of the resistance and made himself useful. He was effusive about Marie, knowledgeable about her work, generous with sympathy, and patient in a way that only a professional can afford to be. When the network around Virginia began, inevitably, to come under strain, he was there to reassure the frightened and to befriend the newly burdened. One by one, in good faith, the people who trusted her introduced him to one another, until much of what remained of her operation lay open to a man who lay in wait, almost like family, in the kitchens and back rooms of the people who thought him a friend. This is the single instance in her war when her instincts, otherwise so finely tuned to danger, let her down, and the cost was catastrophic. The false priest fed names and descriptions to the very officers hunting her. Her closest lieutenants were taken. The doctor whose clinic had been her message drop was hauled off before dawn and held in solitude for the better part of a year. Asked again and again where Marie was, and gave nothing. A radio operator was caught at his set. Couriers were dispatched across the zone in coded haste, a particular color of clothing worn past a particular building, a phrase ordered at a cafe at a precise minute to pass a single warning down the line. Lie low, the heat is on. The web she had spun thread by patient thread was being torn apart faster than she could have rebuilt it, and the people caught in it would pay for their loyalty in ways she could not bear to contemplate. There is a hard lesson buried in this stretch of her life, and she learned it in the worst possible way. The same openness that makes a network grow, the willingness to trust, to introduce, to fold a useful stranger into the family, is the exact vulnerability through which a network dies. In the universe she inhabited, where almost the whole of the continent lay under occupation, trust was a luxury that could not be afforded and could not be entirely done without. She had built something remarkable on her ability to read people. She was betrayed by the one reading she got wrong, and by the autumn of 1942, with her circuits collapsing and the manhunt narrowing toward her, she understood that there was nothing left to hold in Lyon, and only one way out of France, that the enemy was not already watching. The only way out was over the top, on foot, in the cruelest part of the year. The escape line moved her south by van to a barn in the foothills, where she was told to rest a few hours on the straw with the sound of mountain rivers on either side and a great massif towering overhead. She could not rest. Her mind kept returning to the men she was leaving behind in prison, to the rescue she had been forced to abandon half-finished, and she resolved that the moment she reached a consulate on the far side, she would find out what had become of them. At first, Light, her party of 3, set off on foot into the snow, with a guide and 50 miles of mountains between them and Spain. The first miles were merciful, and the rest were not. The track climbed gently at first, then steepened, then turned vertical in everything but name. She carried her bag on her right side to disguise the limp, but after a few hours, the pretense was pointless. The pain in her stump had taken over. The snow deepened to 3 yards in places, and she had no snowshoes and not even a cane. On one side of the path, the mountain dropped away into a void several hundred feet deep. On the other rose a wall of rock with nothing to hold. The wind came at her like something with intent. Her chest heaved for oxygen in the thin air, her head pounded, and the place where her left leg ended wore open again and began to seep into her sock. The 8 pounds of wood and metal strapped to her waist had to be dragged up each step by main force, and with every sideways movement, the prosthetic ground against raw flesh. Younger men, whole-bodied men, had been overcome on this crossing by frostbite or vertigo, or simply the desire to lie down in the snow and stop. She did not have the option of stopping. She drew, as she had in the hospital in Turkey, on her father's words about the duty to survive, and she kept her place in the line. It was somewhere in those hours, by the version of the tale that has come down to us, that she sent the message she is best remembered for. With one of the small wireless sets that might have been in her bag, she is said to have signaled London that her false leg, which she had nicknamed Cuthbert, as though it were a difficult traveling companion, was giving her trouble. "Cuthbert is being tiresome," the message ran, "but I can cope. The duty officer who received it in a quiet country house in Kent had no idea that Cuthbert was a leg. If Cuthbert is tiresome, he signaled back, have him eliminated. Whether the exchange happened precisely so or has been polished by the retelling into something neater than the truth hardly diminishes it. The line endures because it is exactly the kind of thing she would have said. The agony of the climb folded into a single dry joke, the complaint and its own dismissal in the same breath. They reached a shepherd's hut at a high pass and were allowed to stop, huddling together against the cold, eating what little they had carried. And even there she had to keep her ruined leg and her blood-soaked sock hidden from the others. The next morning was worse and steeper still, the mountains rising ahead like a wall built to keep them from freedom, and they climbed in single file to 8,000 feet before the pass finally tipped them over and Spain opened up below. The guide took the last of her money and turned back. There was no resting then either. Another long descent lay ahead, downhill being in some ways the harder direction, because the rigidity of her false ankle forced her to lean unnaturally far forward, and her balance hung by a thread above the drop. She walked through the rest of that day and the whole of the bitter night, urging her exhausted companions on through a pain she could not afford to describe, until the lights of a valley town appeared in the distance and resolved, at last, into the end of it. An official report, written after the war, not given to sentiment, called her crossing a record all by itself. She had walked over the Pyrenees in winter on one leg, with the most powerful police force on the continent at her back, and she had simply refused to be stopped. She should have been finished with France, and France was not finished with her. Spain held her briefly in a cell for crossing without papers. London eventually pulled her out, decorated her quietly, and might reasonably have retired so valuable and so compromised an agent to a desk. She would not have it. The Americans had by now built a secret service of their own, and when she pressed to go back across the channel, they took her on, over the considerable objection of those who still found it controversial to send a woman on a paramilitary operation and inconceivable to put her in command of one. The enemy had not forgotten her. Their officers across France were on standing alert for the limping lady more than a year after she had vanished over the mountains, and they had given her a code name of their own, the Goddess of the Hunt, as though tracking her were a sport that had only paused. So she made herself impossible to find by becoming someone else entirely. On a moonless night in the spring of 1944, she was put ashore on a beach in Brittany, an advance scout for the invasion that everyone knew was coming. The young woman who had once enjoyed dressing as a dashing pirate had this time gone the other way. She had dyed her hair a dirty gray and pinned it into a severe, old-fashioned style learned from Hollywood makeup artists how to pencil convincing age into her face, and bulked out her figure under layers of woolen skirts that also concealed a pistol. She had even had her fine white American teeth ground down to resemble the worn teeth of a French countrywoman, and she had taught herself to shuffle so that the famous gait was gone. The clothes had been made and distressed by refugees in a secret workshop in London, checked down to the way the buttons were threaded, because the French sewed them one way and the Americans another. Her own service had judged that even this was not enough, and pressed her to go under a surgeon's knife to alter her features. She refused, perhaps because of what surgery had once meant in her life, and went back into the most dangerous country in Europe, wearing nothing but her own nerve and a great deal of gray wool. Her official orders were modest, and she exceeded them almost on arrival. She was supposed to find safe houses and support other agents in central France. What she did instead was make her way to a remote plateau in the mountains of the Haute-Loire, a place apart from the rest of the country in spirit as well as altitude. For 400 years, its quietly devout people had sheltered the persecuted, a tradition that in this war made it a refuge for Jews hiding from the camps and young men dodging forced labor, and that would see one of its villages honored, long after, among the righteous of the nations for saving thousands of Jewish lives. Into this landscape of stone houses and stubborn decency came an emissary from London, whose organization the locals could only guess at, asking to find the fighters in the hills. She found them scattered, half-starved, and desperately short of the weapons that would let them do more than hide. Allied command believed the region ripe for insurgency. Key German road and rail routes ran through it, and cutting them mattered enormously, as the invasion in the north turned the whole German position in France into a problem of retreat. Virginia became the fixed point these irregulars organized around, exactly as she had in Lyon, but now in open command of fighting men in a way almost no woman on either side of the war was permitted. She called down parachute drops of arms and explosives, armed and trained the bands in the hills, directed the cutting of rail lines and the blowing of bridges, and reported back to London with a soldier's eye and a guerrilla's instinct. The men sent in to assist her had confessed beforehand to discomfort at the thought of serving under a woman in combat. They were told plainly that her experience put her in charge, and they fell in behind her. When the region was liberated and the official French army came through on a victory march, the secret army she had equipped and led had helped to make it possible. It was the answer to everything that had been taken from her. The country that had filed her under women of no importance had spent a decade telling her what she could not do, could not be a diplomat, could not serve with a missing leg, could not be trusted with command. On a cold plateau in the summer of 1944, with a war won in part by her own hands, every one of those verdicts stood refuted. There is a bitter symmetry worth pausing on. The ordinary peacetime world had kept its doors firmly shut to a one-legged woman of fierce ability, and it took the collapse of the ordinary world into total war to blow those doors off their hinges. Catastrophe gave Virginia Hall the one thing a sane and settled society had refused her: the chance to become, fully and undeniably, what she had always been. The recognition, when it finally came in a small room with the door closed. She returned to the United States in the autumn of 1945, nearly 40 years old, and a stranger in her own country, a land that had left the Depression behind and emerged a victorious superpower while she was gone, and that scarcely knew what to do with the few of its citizens who had spent the whole war behind enemy lines. She had earned the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award the American military can bestow for valor, and she remains to this day the only civilian woman of the Second World War to receive it. The general who ran her Secret Service pinned it on her himself, and would have liked to do it with ceremony, before a president and a crowd, as a demonstration of what his organization could do. She declined the audience. The award was made privately, with a single guest, in an undistinguished office building next to an abandoned gasworks. She wore white, said little, and let the medal be the smallest possible event. Within days, the service that had sent her into France was dissolved by order of a president who distrusted it, and the woman it had decorated was, once again, looking for work. The peace treated her almost exactly as the pre-war years had. The new intelligence agency that rose from the ashes of the old service took her on as one of its first women, and then spent the better part of 2 decades failing to use her. She had commanded fighters in the field, run circuits the enemy had thrown its best men against, and walked over a mountain range on one leg to stay alive. At her desk in Washington, she watched less experienced men sent to do the active work she was best qualified for, while she was routed into the quiet accounts and the backwater files. The agency's own later assessment of her career is unusually candid about why. Her colleagues, it acknowledged, felt she had been sidelined precisely because her experience was so great that it overshadowed the men around her, who found her a threat rather than an asset. One officer put it without varnish. Her abilities, he said, were never properly used. When the mandatory retirement age arrived on her 60th birthday, she drove out of her parking space for the last time, with none of the consultancy or training role that an officer of her record would ordinarily have been offered. It was, by any honest measure, an unworthy end to an extraordinary working life. She met the disappointment the way she had met every other, by refusing to perform it. She had married, late and quietly, a man from her wartime service who understood something of what she had been through, and they kept a French-style house in the Maryland countryside where she gardened ferociously, grew vegetables, and planted thousands of daffodils, kept goats and vicious geese, and cooked elaborate meals with a husband she plainly adored. As her health declined, she let the false leg go at last. Abandoning Cuthbert in a corner in favor of crutches, and spent her days in a chair by the window, watching the birds and feeding a semicircle of poodles from a silver ladle. She read constantly history, travel, and above all spy stories, and to the persistent suggestion that she write her own, she returned a flat refusal for the rest of her life. She had seen too many corpses, she told her niece, of colleagues who had talked. When pressed on why she would not claim the credit so obviously owed her, she waved the whole question away with a line that contains the entire shape of her character. "It was only 6 years of my life." She died in the summer of 1982, 76 years old, of causes that went unreported, having told the world almost nothing about the things she had done better than nearly anyone alive. It is tempting to read her story as a straightforward triumph, and it is not one. Valor, in her case, reaped almost none of the dividend it should have. She was refused for her sex, refused for her body, betrayed by a man she trusted, hunted by an enemy who valued her more accurately than her own government ever did, and finally shelved by the very agency that should have built itself around her. The recognition arrived, as it so often does, after she could no longer feel it. Her name was added to a military hall of fame 6 years after her death. France formally embraced her as a true hero of its resistance. A quarter of a century after the war, she helped it win, in a ceremony where no one present seemed even to know about the medal it had already awarded her. Her own country's intelligence service, in the end, named a building after her, and now teaches new recruits why she was one of the great ones. A posthumous honor for the woman it had let walk quietly out of its parking lot. And yet to leave her there, as a study in injustice, would be to misunderstand what she was after. She had never fought for glory, and she was never really granted it. She had gambled her life again and again, not out of nationalism for her own country, but out of love for the freedoms of another. What she wanted, from the veranda in Maryland, to the marsh in Turkey, to the plateau in the Haute-Loire, was to be useful, to be needed, to matter, to refuse the small and shuttered life that everyone kept trying to hand her. By that measure, the only one she ever truly cared about, she won completely. A nation had filed her away as a woman of no importance. She spent her life proving, to an enemy who understood it sooner than her friends did, that there had never been anyone less important to overlook.